Hello, welcome to this introductory video to Azure Bicep. I'm Chris Jupp. I'm an Azure consultant with Visual, but I'm still new to Bicep. So Wayne, my colleague, is going to teach me and you all about it. Wayne, would you like to introduce yourself and then we'll talk about what we're going to be covering in this video.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Wayne Bellows, Azure consultant at Azure as well. And yeah, I've been playing around with Bicep for sort of the last year or so for some of our landing zone deployments mainly. But yeah, I've got a bit of experience that hopefully I can pass on to some others.
Brilliant. I'm sure we'll all find it useful. So we're going to look at what, oh, you should probably do this. We're going to look at what's Bicep versus ARM, how to get started with Bicep, how to define a resource, some tips and tricks, and then we'll have a look at a live demo. So Wayne, what's Bicep?
Yeah, so there are many ways to provision resources into Azure, so including the Azure portal, the Azure CLI and Azure PowerShell, which all use Azure Resources Manager REST APIs. So an alternative to use infrastructure as code, which uses ARM templates, which is Azure Resource Manager templates. So this is a good approach to take to automate deployments, as the Azure infrastructure is defined as code, so it can be reused and can minimize errors. So ARM templates, which are JavaScript, so JSON files that define infrastructure and configuration for a project.
Right. So it sounds like there's an infrastructure as code solution already. So what's with Bicep then?
Yeah, I mean, ARM templates are a popular approach for DevOps engineers, but they're known to be complex, can be hard to learn and to manage. That's why Microsoft introduced this new language called Bicep that comes with the same capabilities as ARM templates, but with a cleaner syntax. It improves type safety and better support for modularity and code reuse. So Bicep automatically converts in the background to an ARM template when you go to deploy it into Azure.
Right. So even though you're using Bicep to write your code, behind the scenes everything gets converted to an ARM template.
Yeah, that's right. As soon as you deploy it, Azure converts it to an ARM template, and then the Azure Resource Manager converts it and creates the resources which are in the code.
Right.
Yeah. So Bicep also immediately supports all previews and GA versions for Azure services. So as soon as a resource provider introduces new resource types and API versions, you can use them in your Bicep file. So you don't have to wait for tools to be updated before using the new services.
Sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah. So if you're used to using ARM templates, it's relatively quick and easy to start using Bicep to deploy your Azure resources. So your Bicep code will most likely be shorter and more concise than the equivalent ARM templates. So take this example. This is creating a storage account using Bicep and ARM templates.
Right. So these two scripts would create the same thing as you.
Yes, so both these templates do exactly the same thing. So as you can see, it takes a lot less Bicep code to deploy a storage account than it does using the equivalent ARM templates. This is just a simple example of one storage account, but as you deploy more and more Azure resources, it can take less and less code to deploy via Bicep than it does using the JSON ARM templates. And you can decompile ARM templates into Bicep if you already have a library of ARM templates and want to use Bicep going forward.
So that's great. So you don't have to throw away your code.
Yeah, exactly. You can keep most of what you've already done, not start from scratch. However, Microsoft do advise that the Bicep file may need revisions to implement sort of Bicep best practices, just to make sure it's all up to scratch, really.
Right.
But to decompile an ARM template into Bicep, you would use the code on the screen there in the bottom corner. So this just says so AZ Bicep decompile file, and then you just have the name of the ARM template that you want to convert into Bicep.
Sounds like a useful tool. Did you have any experience of doing those conversions from ARM to Bicep? How did it go?
Yeah, I had a few ARM templates that I wanted to convert into Bicep, and a lot of the examples online sort of exist in ARM templates because they've been around for a few years now. So it's a good tool to use to quickly convert them into Bicep. And then the process isn't perfect, but it does most of the heavy lifting for you. So you just need to go back over the converted Bicep file and sort of tidy it up to use the Bicep best practices. But this process is fairly straightforward, and after you've done it a couple of times, it's sort of becomes second nature to you. And there's also a Microsoft Bicep Playground, which they offer. So this is a side-by-side view which shows the equivalent Bicep and ARM templates. So it allows you to select sample templates and also upload your own ARM templates and convert it into Bicep. So as you can see here on the left hand side, we've got the Bicep code, and on the right hand side we've got the ARM templates.
Yeah, that does look rather different and quite useful. Yes. Yeah,
it's great. So as you can see, this code is just creating a virtual machine, and you can see the Bicep code. What's that? 204 lines, and then on the right hand side you can see the ARM template equivalent, which is 255 lines. So it cuts down the amount of code, and I think, as you can see, it makes it a little easier to read and to understand kind of what's going on with the Bicep compared to the ARM templates.
Yeah, and we've got nice color coding on the Bicep files as well there, which may not seem like much, but it does make it easier to follow and see what's going on.
Yeah, definitely.
Right, so what do we need? What do we need to get started?
Yeah, so it's pretty simple. You need a few things to get started, really. So you need to install some of these tools. So you can use Azure CLI or the Azure PowerShell to install Bicep. And you need Visual Studio Code, which is a great tool to compile and edit your code. It's a source code editor which has powerful developer tooling like IntelliSense, which we'll see a bit later on, for code completion, and is available in Mac OS, in Linux, and for Windows.
Yes, it's a great tool. I use it for my PowerShell scripts. I've got another use for it now. Great.
Yeah, no, it's great. I've been using it a lot. So yeah, once you've installed Visual Studio Code, there's a Bicep extension which you need to install from the Visual Studio Marketplace. And then on the screen here, you can see the QR codes for links to these Bicep prerequisites, and the URLs are under there.
Great, it's very useful.
Cool.
So now this looks like some real code. What are we looking at here? What does this do?
Yeah, so the main thing you do with Bicep templates is define your Azure resources. So almost anything that you can deploy in the Azure portal, you can define as an Azure resource in Bicep code. So here's an example of a typical resource definition in Bicep. This example creates a storage account.
I see. Okay, so talk us through this then. What's all the bits of this code?
So let's look through each of the different components of the definition and talk about what each one does and why it's there. So firstly, we've got the resource keyword. This tells Bicep that we're about to define a resource. You'll use this keyword a lot in Bicep. It's kind of the bread and butter of Bicep. So then you provide a symbolic name. So in this example, we've given the resource a symbolic name of storage account. So a symbolic name is used only within the Bicep file. It's a way for us as Bicep authors to refer to this resource. The symbolic name never appears within Azure.
Okay. So would it make sense to use some kind of prefix or maybe my initials or something to indicate that something to indicate that this is a symbolic name? I can imagine it might get confusing if you refer to storage account as my thing that I want to do in my code, but also, of course, it's the actual storage account I'm going to create, or even storage accounts in general.
Yeah, I mean, you can use sort of anything for the symbolic name. It doesn't have to be storage account, for instance, as long as it sort of makes sense to you and with whoever you're sharing the file with, a member of your team or something, then it doesn't matter too much what you put as the symbolic name, but it is good practice to use camel case and for it to be a descriptive name for whatever resource you're creating.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
So then we move on to the resource type and the API version. So every resource in Azure has a resource type. In this example, our resource type is Microsoft.storage/storage accounts. So every resource type has at least one, but usually many different API versions. So these are essentially versions of the product that have been released by Microsoft, which you use to interact with Azure. In this example, our API version is 2021-0801. So this will be the date that the API version got released. And generally speaking, you want to use the latest API version for whatever resource type you're defining.
Yeah, that makes sense. Is there a way of knowing whether there is a later version or you should be moving to a newer version?
Yeah, we'll come to that in a couple of slides' time. We'll see how Visual Studio Code and the Bicep extension can really help in this area.
Okay, great.
Cool. And then if we move on, so next you define a name. So this is the actual name of the storage account that will appear in Azure. Mm-hmm. So this is different from the symbolic name that we defined earlier, which only appears in our Bicep file. So most Azure names can't be changed once created. So you need to make sure what you're using is correct and has some sort of meaning, and there might be some naming rules depending on what Azure resources you're building. So different resources have different rules around uniqueness, length, and what characters are allowed. So just make sure that you're conforming to those rules.
Yes, it's often difficult to explain some of those rules to customers when everybody's new to Azure. So yes.
Yeah, the Microsoft docs are good for looking up naming conventions and things like that. So then we move on to define the location for our storage account. So this is the Azure region we're placing the resource in. So in this example, we're locating the resource in West US 3, so it will be somewhere on the West US coast.
Okay. So when writing your code, can you validate what's valid before you deploy? I'm thinking that quite a lot of our customers would use Azure policy to restrict where resources can be created. So UK only, for example, is quite common in the customers we see. Can you check that in advance when you're creating your code?
Yeah, so before deploying a Bicep file, you can preview the changes that will happen. So the Azure Resource Manager provides the what if operation to let you see how resources will change if you deploy the bicep file. So the what if operation doesn't make any changes to existing resources. It just predicts the changes if the specified resource file is deployed.
Right. Yeah, it's a very useful function. I use it in PowerShell all the time.
Yeah, it's quite handy. And then we move on to the properties, which will be different depending on what type of resource you're deploying. So this storage account has some properties which we need to set. So one of them, for example, is a SKU. So this tells us how many replicas of our data we need. So here we're using standard LRS, which is the cheapest storage tier, but there are lots of others that you can configure as well. Then we need to define the kind of storage account we're deploying. So again, here we're using storage v2. So I don't want to go into too much detail about the different kinds of storage accounts that you can have. But for now, you just need to know that there are different resource types, have different properties that you need to define. And then we come to the additional properties. So almost all resource types will have this additional properties section where you can set a bunch of other properties as well. So again, these will be specific to whatever we're deploying. And then in this example, we're specifying the access tier as hot.
I see. So how do you know what properties you need to set when you're defining your bicep file?
Yeah, so I would strongly recommend to use the Visual Studio Code with the Bicep extension, as we talked about just now, to author your Bicep templates, as it can help in this area enormously. So when you start typing in Visual Studio Code, there's a feature called IntelliSense, which comes up with suggestions about what you're typing. So you can see in this screenshot, you start typing resource and it comes up saying, do you want to create a resource? So you would press enter and it would move on to the next part of the resource. So you put the symbolic name in, and then if you wanted to create a storage account, start typing storage, and then it starts bringing up a list of what it thinks you're trying to deploy. So you can see at the top there, this one's a storage account. So you would just press enter and it would fill in the type for you. And then once you've chosen your resource type, you'll then be provided with all of the API versions. So you can choose which is the latest API version, which is at the top of the list.
You've answered my earlier question.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's really handy. So you can always have the latest one be at the top of the list, but if you did want to have an older one, if there was some older feature or something that you wanted to take advantage of, you can scroll through the list and select an older version.
I guess that means that old bicep files will still continue to work. They just won't necessarily be taking advantage of the latest features.
Yeah, and it's a good sort of best practice is to, if your code is a year or two old, it can be good to go back through and just sort of update your API versions to the latest versions to take advantage of any of the new features. And then so it can also populate the resource with the required properties. So you know what properties you need to define for that resource type. So this will provide you with all of the properties that you need to set for your resource type. So for instance, with this example we did in the storage account, so once you've put in your symbolic name, chosen your type and your API, it will then come up there with a suggestion, do you want to use the required properties? So if you select that, it will then display the name, the location, the SKU, and the kind for you. So you just have to enter in the values.
Great. I can see that will help. So what if you want to define these additional properties?
Yeah, so what you can do is press Control plus space in Visual Studio Code, and it will display all of the properties that you can define for that resource type. So depending on what level within the resource you are, you can press Control Space and it gives you different property options.
Wow. Is that a Bicep thing or Visual Studio Code? I've never seen that before. Can I do that with PowerShell commands and properties?
Yeah, I mean, I believe so. So that sort of feature is sort of supplied by the Visual Studio Code Bicep extension. So if you have that installed, then you get all these great features. But yeah, I believe there's a PowerShell extension that you can install for PowerShell and have sort of similar functionality. But if you're still a bit hesitant about what properties you should configure for your resource, you can look at the Microsoft documentation.
Let's do that.
Yes, so if
do
I just bring that up on the screen. Great, so you can see at the top here, you've got your API version. You can use the latest or you can scroll back through over previous versions. And then you have the template format, so it shows you what format that resource should be in with all of its properties and some example values. You can also,
yeah, sorry.
You can also switch over to the old JSON view if you want to compare the two.
No, we're done with that. Bicep all the way.
Definitely. If you scroll down, it's got all of the property values that you can have for that resource. So you've got the name, description, and the value that you can have for that property. So there's quite a few properties in the storage account. So it's got all of these in the list here. And then if you scroll right down to the bottom, you'll see there are some quick start templates that you can use. So these are examples that other people have used to deploy their storage accounts. So you can open these up, and it's often in GitHub, and you'll see you can deploy these resources straight into Azure, or you can click on the Bicep file and look at the actual code, which other people have used to deploy their storage accounts. So you can look up examples on, take ideas on how to do it for yourself. So let's just have a quick recap on what we've gone through so far. So here are some tips for defining resources in Bicep. So the Visual Studio Code extension for Bicep helps you to find the resource types and API versions for the resources that you create. If you're familiar with ARM templates, note that the API version matches the version you've used there too. And the symbolic names are used only within the Bicep file and don't appear in Bicep, in Azure. And resource names do appear in Azure.
Great. So that's a good starting point. So how about where resources interact? Usually when I'm going to deploy resources into Azure, I'm not just deploying one thing. I'll probably be deploying several things together. So how does that work? And what if we've got one resource that depends on another, for example?
Yeah. So some of these resources will depend on each other and will need to be deployed in a certain order. So if you look at this example on the screen, if you're deploying a web application, it will have dependencies on other resources. So you'll need to deploy an app service plan, which sort of represents the server hosting resources, and then deploy the app service app. Now the plan needs to be deployed first and then the app. So this resource defines the app service plan. So this is the top one. So you can see we deploy the name, location, and the SKU for the plan. And then under that, you define the app service app. So we define the app name, the location, the server farm ID, and the HTTPS settings. Now the server farm ID property defines where this app will be deployed to, which needs to be associated with a plan. So we've already deployed the plan. So in the server farm ID, we can reference the plan with the symbolic name of the plan resource. So to correctly link the app to the plan, Bicep needs the resource ID of the plan. So after we define the symbolic name of the plan, we end it with .id. So this accesses the resource ID of the plan, and by doing this, Azure understands the implicit dependency the app has on the plan. So Azure will fully deploy the plan before it deploys the app.
Right, I see. So we don't need to create the app service plan, get the ID back in our code, and then declare it as a parameter and use it. Bicep just takes care of that for us.
Yeah, it's much easier to reference a resource by a symbolic name rather than trying to find the resource ID and then reference that. I think it's much easier to write the code and to read it using this way.
Yeah, that looks really quite helpful. Tell me how deep can you go? Sounds like it could get quite complex if you do a large scale deployment, for example.
Yeah. So for this example, it's fairly straightforward. So when you get your head around referencing resources this way, it becomes sort of second nature. But yeah, it does get more complicated when, for example, you go to create a virtual machine. So you have to create the virtual machine NIC, the disks, and then the VM separately, and then sort of reference the individual resources to create the whole VM. And so this can get even more complicated when you start specifying the virtual networking and adding it into an application security group.
Yeah.
But you get used to it after doing it a few times.
Yeah, I'm sure. No, yeah, that's good to hear. Get there in the end. So you've got the slide up there. So how do we get this deployed? What do we have to do?
Yep. So once you've written your Bicep code, you'll want to deploy the template to Azure and build your resources. So you can do this from within Visual Studio Code as well, using the terminal. So you can use both Azure CLI and PowerShell to deploy your Bicep templates. The Microsoft documentation shows how to use both, so it mainly comes down to sort of personal preference when deciding which to use. If you're familiar with PowerShell, like myself, it can be easier to use PowerShell, but Azure CLI does give a good experience, and this seems to be the direction Microsoft pushing people.
Yeah, I've noticed that in a lot of the examples online, you'll see the CLI version only.
Gotcha. Yeah, they seem to be pushing it a bit more than PowerShell, but so most of the examples include PowerShell as well. But yeah, some of the latest ones only show CLI. But yeah, so Bicep files have a default deployment scope of resource group, meaning when you deploy your Bicep file, you would have to define what resource group you want to deploy your Bicep template to.
Right, that's just a default. You can deploy at the subscription level, say, in order to create that resource group in the first place.
Yeah, definitely. So you can deploy Bicep templates to other scopes as well, such as the tenant management group and the subscription scopes. But for now, just need to know that certain Azure resources need to be deployed at certain scopes. So for instance, to create a resource group, you would have to deploy it at least at the subscription scope.
Right. So what's this command on screen doing then?
Yeah, so to deploy our Bicep template to a resource group, we would use this Azure CLI command below. So this specifies what we're doing. We're deploying to a group. That group's called demo1, and the file that we're using to deploy is main.bicep.
Okay, so main.biceps, that's just a big file of all of the resources that you want to create. Is that right?
Yeah. So Microsoft sort of best practice suggests using the name main as your Bicep template name. So this main template would typically contain your resources to be deployed into Azure. So Bicep also enables you to organize deployments into modules. So a module is a Bicep file that is deployed from another Bicep file.
So it's not a big monolithic main.bicep isn't necessarily a big monolith. You've got modules within other files.
Yeah, that's the main idea, to split it out into modules so you can use them for other deployments. You can pass in different parameters to create different environments from the same module. And splits it out makes it a bit easier to read rather than having one massive long template.
I see. Great. Well, that seems like a brilliant introduction. Shall we have a go?
Yeah. Do you want to deploy some code, and we'll show you how easy it is?
All right. I'll have a go. Share my screen now. Okay. So slightly cheated here, and I've created a main.bicep file, but as you can see, it's currently empty. So what was it we were doing? We're going to need to create a resource, yes?
Yeah, so if you start typing, you can see that IntelliSense pops up and says, are you trying to create a resource? So you just click enter on that, and then it would fill that in for you. So yeah, next is just go space, and then we type in the symbolic name, so you can just call it storage account. Great, and then just start typing storage account, and again, IntelliSense will predict what you're trying to create. And as you can see, storage account's the top one, so we can just press enter on there again, and it will create that for you. And again, with the API version, you can see that the latest version is already selected at the top there. So again, just need to press enter, and that will select it for you.
See that?
Cool. So yeah, we just go equals and then space again, and then as you can see here, it's going to provide the required property. So we just press enter on that one, and it will show the name, location, SKU, and kind. So we just need to then fill in these values.
Demo test. That'll do. Oh, we've got to put these in quotes, don't we?
Yes, just start and start and end. And location. Yep, so we just deploy to UK South, and then we just need a SKU name. So we can just do this to standard LRS will be fine for now. That's the cheapest option.
Okay.
And then the kind, we just want storage v2.
Great. And that's it.
Great. Yep, so if we save that file, then that's our Bicep template complete, really. That just deploys a single storage account. So then, as you can see down the bottom, we've got the terminal open with PowerShell, and you can type the PowerShell command in there to deploy our Bicep file into a resource group. But it depends if you've got a resource group already. You might just need to create one first.
I don't actually, so let's do new resource. Oops, new AZ resource group, isn't that?
Yeah,
new AZ group.
You can call your resource group whatever you want. This for demo ones, just are just for demo purposes.
This is where. Oh no, there we go.
Cool. Yeah, great. So the resource group's been created in Azure. So then we can just deploy our Bicep file to that new resource group.
Okay, so that's new AZ.
Resource group deployment. Yep, that's the one.
Is deploy or deployment?
That's a good question.
But I'll tell you what, we've got autocomplete, haven't we? There we go. It's worked it out for us.
So we just need to specify the template file, so what file we want to deploy to Azure.
Okay, so that's presumably file.
I think it's template file for that one.
Fine.
Oh, I don't think you need the dash in front of main.
There
Yep.
we go. And that's I think you had resource group, didn't you?
Yes, yeah, we just need to specify which resource group we're going to deploy it to.
Okay.
So hopefully we've typed that right. So yeah, as you can see, that's starting to deploy.
Okay.
To Azure. So if you've got the portal open, we can actually go to the resource group, and you'll see under deployments, it will say one deploying. So yeah, you can see that's deploying. You can see the deployment name is main. That's the name of the template that we're using. And then in here, you can see that it's already deployed the storage account. So you can click on, yeah, if you click on deployment details, that should show us what's been created. So you can see it's got the storage account there. If you click on the resource, and that should take us through to see the storage account which has been created. So you can see there the resource group is demo1, locations UK South, and we've created it using LRS replication. So yeah, that all looks correct.
Wonderful.
Cool.
Oh, and we've got the confirmation back.
Yes, yeah, you can see back in the terminal that's all gone through okay, and we've got provisioning state of succeeded.
So what do we got in our warning here? Oh, it doesn't like us hard coding UK South as a.
Yes, yeah, it will come up with a warning. You can use a parameter to specify location. Yeah.
Yeah, that was in your original. Back in your original slide. So. But yeah, that was nice and simple. That's really simple, really easy, and it worked first time. It's amazing.
It's always good when it works.
Yeah. Right. So thank you, Wayne. As we put up on the screen, Wayne wrote a blog post about this, which I recommend reading. And we're going to do another little video coming up soon. What are we going to talk about in that, Wayne?
Yeah, so we'll dive into Bicep in a bit more detail. So we'll look at conditions, so the conditional deployment. So you can provide a parameter, for instance, to deploy a resource or not to deploy a resource, or to put it into a certain environment. We'll have a look at sort of production environments and non-production environments, and using conditions for that. And we'll also have a look at loops. So being able to deploy sort of multiple resources using sort of minimal code. So if you want to create 5 storage accounts instead of creating 5 separate resources which create your storage accounts, you can just have one resource, and it's goes through a loop and creates all of the resources that you want.
Okay, sounds interesting. I look forward to learning more and building another script next time.
Yes, yeah, we'll go through some examples and get some demos on the go, and yeah, should be good.
Brilliant. Thank you. Cheerio all.
Thanks. Bye.